Welcome back to the Virtual Academy session on the modern work style enabled. What I want to do now is move into talking about the full Windows experience anywhere and how, doesn't matter what device you're on, what we are doing to give you a great Windows experience and access to your corporate data. We talked in the previous session about Microsoft VDI and what we're doing to enable, making it easy for you as an IT guy to set up a remote desktop environment for your users. What I want to talk about now is what we are doing in Server 2012 to make that a great experience. Microsoft Remote Desktop Services has been around for a long time, going all the way back to terminal services. And one of the comments we always had was that the protocol was great in a LAN environment, but once you got into slower networks, once you got into a WAN environment, the RDP protocol didn't work as well, and people actually looked at other products, or WAN accelerators or things to try to make that experience better. There's been a tremendous amount of work in Server 2012 with what we call RemoteFX for WAN to make that a great experience. There's a few different ways that we've done that, and I want to talk about some of those. As I said in the past, RDP was a great LAN protocol. We're now saying it is a great WAN protocol. There's a few ways that we've done that. One is allowing the change in transport from TCP to UDP, and it's kind of it seems like an obvious thing, but let me explain how that works. When you're using TCP, the TCP protocol for traffic, every packet that you send over the wire has to be acknowledged that the endpoint received that packet. And if any packets don't get an acknowledgement back, the server resends them. UDP traffic, we just send it. You can think of it as dropping postcards in the mail without a receipt required or acknowledgement required that they were there. For certain kinds of traffic, that makes a lot more sense. For example, if I'm watching a video inside a remote desktop session, if a few packets are dropped along the way, I don't really need those packets to be resent, because by the time they are resent, my video has moved on. I'm 3 or 4 seconds ahead in the video. I don't need those old packets anymore. So there's no reason to resend them. With UDP traffic, that's effectively what we're doing. If we detect that there is video on the screen as part of a remote desktop session, we switch the codec we're using for that traffic to UDP, and we just send the packets once, because we assume that, if some of them weren't delivered, the packet will just be, you don't need them to be resent because the video has moved on, for example. We also do some automatic detection now of network conditions, and we'll automatically determine that, wow, the network speed just dropped way down. So let's change the compression that we're doing to take advantage of that. Let's maybe turn off some features, some animations, maybe turn off desktop background. Let's do some things to say, hey, this is a slower network connection, so let's make some changes to improve performance based on that. And of course, the product is fully integrated with our remote desktop gateway, so if you don't have a VPN or you don't want to put a VPN or a direct access environment in place but still allow people to access corporate desktops, we can do that with our gateway, and the gateway supports all of this new functionality. Some of the other things that we're doing, another feature in RemoteFX is USB redirection. So it's great that I can be sitting at home with my personal PC or my personal laptop even, and access my remote desktop at work. But what about devices? What if what I want to do is now print a document on the inkjet printer that I've got at home, or I want to do some web conferencing, so I want to be able to plug in a camera and use that camera inside my remote desktop session. We now do complete USB redirection. So any USB device that you plug into your local personal PC or laptop or whatever it is, you can access that device inside the remote desktop session or within the VDI session. Now, as an administrator, you can configure that. If you don't want people plugging devices in, you can set up policies and you can configure all of that. But for example, any printers, any scanners, thumb drives, voice over IP headphones, headsets, As I said, webcams, really any USB device you plug in will just remote that USB bus up to the remote session and make that available. So it solves a lot of the problems with printing and things that have happened in the past. Another improvement is what we call Remote FX. There's a lot of new Remote FX features. One of them being adaptive graphics. Again, this is where if we detect a slow link on the network, we'll send the data across. When we see images on the screen, we'll send a very heavily compressed version of the image first, and then deliver some other kind of more refined images. It's a little bit what surfing the internet was like in the 90s. If you ever surfed the internet on a dial-up connection, you remember as you loaded websites, first you'd get a heavily pixelated image of a picture, and then it would slowly refine that picture. If we detect a slow link, we do the same thing now within Remote FX. What that means is if you're surfing the web or working on documents within that remote session, we don't have to wait for the entire screen to be drawn in high resolution. We can deliver all the text and everything very quickly, and then we just bring those pictures in as we have more bandwidth available. Media remoting is another just kind of an intelligent feature and a way to reduce traffic on the wire. If you think about the idea of watching a video in a remote desktop session, when I open that file, that MPEG file or H.264 encoded file, whatever it is, my machine goes through a whole process of decompressing the video file and then sending that uncompressed stream across the wire to display it on my local machine. Well, in a lot of cases, my local machine is perfectly capable of doing that decode of video itself. So rather than do all that decoding and decompressing process on the server, and now using all of my bandwidth to send that uncompressed file across the wire, what we can do is detect that, hey, this endpoint is a PC, or it's a Remote FX capable thin client device. It can do media. It can do that media playback itself. So instead of the server using all of its CPU to decompress and decode that image, and then pushing it over the wire and using all our bandwidth, let's just send the compressed stream to the end client and let that end client device do the decoding and playback. So it looks perfectly seamless to the user. They just see their video playing, and it's very crisp and smooth, even though it's playing within a VDI session. That's because we're taking advantage of the local CPU to do that decompressing, and we've also taken a lot of that load off the wire. Remote FX multi-touch. This is a great Windows 8 feature. We fully remote the touch experience, which means if I've got a touch-capable device as my endpoint device, and I'm connecting into a Windows Server 8, a Windows 8 client, I get the full touch experience. I get that full Metro experience, multi-touch. I can, pinch and zoom and things like that. And then finally, the other thing that we can take advantage of is putting virtual GPUs or putting physical GPUs in servers. So if I want to do high-end 3D work, Remote FX GPUs allows me to put graphics cards in my servers and assign those graphics cards to virtual machines. And then if I'm doing, CAD/CAM work or any other kind of 3D intense work within a virtual machine, it's able to leverage a video card to offload a lot of that video processing work too. If you don't have a video card in your server, that's okay. What we've done is created a synthetic GPU that just runs on the CPU. So your CPU utilization is higher on the server, but we can still deliver some of that rich 3D, video work type environment. Whatever would be leveraging a GPU is going to be available to you as well that way. So those are all great features that allow an end user to have a good experience, even if they're on a slow connection, even if they're not on the corporate network. We can still deliver a great Windows experience for them. One of the other features that we've included is what we call user profile disk. Now, previously I talked about this idea of virtual machine pools where we just have one image. We have one kind of base template of our operating system. And when I connect in, I'm just, when I initiate a connection into that VDI pool, I'm just connected to the next available machine. It delivers that desktop to me. I do whatever work I'm doing, and then when I log out, we discard any changes that were made there. Any files that were saved, any settings, wallpaper changes or application changes to settings that I made, we just discard all of that. It makes pooled images very, very easy to manage, because we're not trying to save any of that state, and we're not trying to keep an image for each user to connect to. But the downside of that is now we've lost this personalization. So that's why we've created user profile disks. A user profile disk is very easy for an administrator to set up. We just set up a directory to store user profile disks in. When a user logs into that virtual machine pool or a remote desktop session host, all of their data, so any documents that they create, any settings that they change, are all stored in a separate user profile disk. You can think of this as kind of a thin file that what we do is we dynamically mount it to the pooled VM when they connect in. And that's where all of their changes and settings are stored. So when they log out, their changes were all written into this user profile disk. We discard anything that happened in that virtual machine pooled image. The next time they connect in, we connect into another machine in the pool. We transparently mount their user profile disk. So it looks to the user like local data. It looks like they're just working locally, storing things locally, changing settings locally. When they log out, all of their changes were kept in that profile disk. So the next time they log in, they follow them there. Okay, the final piece to the flexible work style and how we enable that is in data security and compliance. This is a big issue, right? You want to make sure that if users are accessing corporate data that's potentially sensitive corporate data, how do we make sure that the data is safe if it's not inside the corporate network? And there's a couple of features that we're using there. One of them is what we call dynamic access control. This is the ability for you as an administrator to set up rules on data and rules on permissions for data. So, in the past, you could set up a file share, and you could say only this particular group of users has access to the files in this directory, and any files that are created in this directory inherit this set of permissions. But the problem is, what if a file gets created somewhere else? What if someone works in finance and they don't like that every time they create a file in the finance directory, it's got permission so no one else can use it? So they create it somewhere else, even though it contains finance data. Or what if they copy that file out of that directory and they take it with them, they put it on the thumb drive and go somewhere else with it? How do you make sure that that data is still safe and secure and maintain the integrity on it? This is the kind of thing we can do with dynamic access control. We can actually look at the content of a file, and we can set up rules to say, hey, if a document contains the word classified, or if a document contains what looks like a social security number, or what looks like it could be a credit card number, let's automatically put permissions on that file. And we'll actually put the permissions on the file itself, so that if the user takes the file somewhere else, we can still prompt them to make sure that they have permission to that file. Or if it contains what looks like important payroll information, how do we just make sure that file doesn't go anywhere at all? These are the kinds of things that we can do with dynamic access control. We can also do access denied remediation. So let's say we have a new user, a new employee who's just started in the finance department, and they go to the finance directory and start and try to access files that they legitimately need to use because they work in finance. What we can do is prompt them with they're actually presented with a dialog box that says, you don't have access to this file, would you like to request access to the file? When they say yes, the administrator actually gets an email that says this user is requesting access to this file. The administrator can say, yep, that's a user that works in finance, they should have access to those files. They can go ahead and grant it right there without having to go through a whole process of creating a lot of groups and things. We can automatically do that remediation and get the user put into whatever groups and give them the permissions that they need. Again, we talked about the integration with rights management services, which is what gives us the capability to say, if a document looks like it contains payroll information, assign a set of rights to it to say that it can't be forwarded, that only certain people have access to it, that it can't be printed, and that the file is encrypted, so that if somebody does put it on a thumb drive and take it with them somewhere, and it's opened up and let's say they lose that thumb drive, somebody finds it in a parking lot and plugs it in, they don't have access to those files, they're not going to be able to open those up. All of this has some very easy to manage audit rules, central policies, makes it very easy for you to track your compliance. So now we can audit and see exactly who has requested access to a file, who's actually been successful at opening files. So now you know, as an administrator, you've got that compliancy to say, yep, this was a document that contains classified information about maybe mergers and acquisitions, who's actually read that file, who's got access to the file. You can see all of that from one place. We make it very easy for you as an administrator to make sure that your data is maintaining its integrity and compliant with whatever rules need to be in place there. With that, let's take a look and do a demo of dynamic access control.
So we're going to show you now dynamic access control central access policies. And first of all, we're now on the domain controller. And on the domain controller, we have here in the Active Directory Administrative Center, we have here defined two central access policies that control access to data in files based on what the files are. And if we look at one of them, the department access policy, we can see that this is targeted at the files that are marked with a specific department. And the access says, allow access only if the user department equals the resource department. We also have another central access policy that protects high impact data. And this central access policy says that for all resources where impact equals high, we will only allow access to the owner of the data or the administrators or the system. So we define this in Active Directory. Now let's go to the file server to see how we can actually have these safety net central access policies take effect on the file server. So I'm switching to the file server here. And on the file server we have several shares. One of them is the department shares. So on this department share I'm going to now apply these central access policies. And I'm doing that by going to the Properties, Security, Advanced. And in here I have a new tab called Central Policy. When I go to that tab, I can now go ahead and apply Central Access Policy from Active Directory. And as you can see, we have these two Central Access Policies that we are now applying to these, which are the High Impact Access Rule and the Department Access Rule that we just seen in Active Directory. Now, the business owner of the data can go into the appropriate folder where data resides and tag the data as which department it's from. To do this, I'm going to go ahead to the Finance department and I'm going to right-click Properties, Classification, which is a new tab, and I can now assign a department to this folder and I'm going to choose Finance. Once I did that, all the files under this folder are now tagged as Finance, and even if the file moves out, as long as it's on NTFS, it's going to be tagged as Finance. So we applied central access policies to all these shares, and we also tagged the information appropriately. You can see, for example, in the operation, I already pre-tagged it with the classification of department equals operations. So now let's go ahead to the user side and see how the users can access data based on these central access policies. So if I go now to my client machine, let's first see who this user is. So I'm going to PowerShell and I'm running the who am I, and I'm looking at the user claims in the user token, and I can see that the user is from the department operations and is from company Fabricam. So if he's from department operations, he should be able to access operations data but not finance data. Let's go ahead and give it a try. Let's go to the department shares. And in the department shares, as I said, the user can access operation data because he needs to do his job. But if he's kind of interested to see what's going on in the finance department, when he double clicks on this, he'll get access denied. And the access is denied because of the central access policy that says user.department needs to be equal to resource.department. You can also see that this access denied is actually much more contextual than the regular access denied that we've seen prior to Windows 8. And this is because we now allow the administrator to send a more contextual information to the user so that he can try and troubleshoot the issue himself, or he can also request assistance and send an email to the appropriate people on the file server so that they can help him. So let's say he did send this email and this got to the file server administrator. Now I'm going to switch back to the file server. As the administrator, I got this request to access my finance information, and I can go ahead and right-click Properties and go to Security Advanced, and then go ahead and look why this user did not have access to this data. So I'm going to select the user, which is Tim, and I'm going to say to view what's his effective access, which is basically why I didn't get data. And I can see here that it didn't get access to the data because of the department access rule that we've just seen configured in Active Directory. And now I can go to my central policy and say, okay, what's the department access rule? Oh, it's, user.department needs to be equal resource.department. So let me go ahead and see how I can actually help Tim get access to this data. I can go back to effective access and I can say, let me model what would happen if the department for Tim was the finance department. And I can see that now Tim will have access to the data if his department was finance. So I can not only see why Tim does not have access, I can also model what would happen if I change some of Tim's group permissions or claims so that I can potentially allow him to access the data. Now, with this information at hand, I need to go ahead and, of course, if I decide to have Tim access the data, I need to add him to the finance department, which I can do if that's the right thing to do. But what we've shown you is the ability to apply safety net central access policies across the organization that are based on who the user is and what the information is, and also troubleshoot cases where the user does not have access to that information. Now let me show you another thing that's adding more dynamic evaluation into this equation. So up to now I tagged the files by the owner of the data. In this case I was the owner of the finance department. But let's say that somebody inadvertently took some file with private information such as credit card information and put it into some public shares. Now what's going to happen right now is that on this file server we also have automatic classification rules that look for information that is sensitive, that has credit card information, and mark this information as high impact. So if I go ahead and look at the classification now of this information, of this file, I will see that it's marked as impact equals high. Now you remember we had that central access policy that says for high impact files, users that are allowed to see them are only owners, administrators of the system. So if I go ahead and go back to the user, to the client machine, and I'm going to log in as Tim to the public shares, you'll see that Tim cannot even see that file because I also enabled another feature on this specific public share, which is access-based enumeration, that does not allow users to see files that they don't have access to. So what happens right now is that the file was put on the public shares, it got automatically classified as high impact, and the safety net access policy, central access policy for high impact kicked in and did not allow Tim to see it, so the team cannot even see that the file is there. So we're able to dynamically classify the data and then apply the right access policy based on this classification. Last but not least, let's see what happens for sensitive information that leaves the file server itself. So, the information is protected by the central access policies on the file server, but what happens if somebody takes that information and attaches it to an email and sends it out? For that specific type of sensitive information, for Office document, we actually allowed to take a step further and RMS encrypt sensitive information so that even if it leaves the file server, it's still protected by that RMS encryption layer. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take another file, which is on Teams desktop, and it also contains some confidential information. And I'm going to, again, copy it into the public shares. What the system does right now, it sees that there is a new file. It's going to automatically classify it as being high impact. And then it also has some rules to say, oh, if it's high impact, go ahead and write manage encrypt it so that even if it's sent out of the server, it's going to be protected. So if we look at the file right now, if we open it, you'll see that now it's actually RMS encrypted, and it's encrypted with the high impact data template for the organization, so that now even if I have access to it and I inadvertently take it and attach it to an email, it's going to be still encrypted and protected to that template. So what we've seen is that we've seen the ability to tag data and apply policy based on who the user is and what the data is. We've also seen that we can both manually and automatically tag the data, and as a further step, we're also able to RMS encrypt specific sensitive data for Office documents so that even if the file leaves the file server, it's still protected by that RMS encryption layer that we apply to it. So to summarize, dynamic access control allows organizations to identify the data that they have, apply the right central access policies to control access to this data, audit access to the data so that they can use it for compliance and forensic analysis, and RMS encrypt specific sensitive Office information so that even if it leaves the organization's boundaries, it's still protected by that encryption technology.
Another key piece of what we're doing with enhanced data security and compliance is what we call user device affinity. This is a new feature in Server 2012 that leverages Active Directory. And it really allows you to specify if I've got roaming profiles so that whenever a user sits down at a machine, we automatically put a copy of their data on that local machine so they can access it locally, and then when they log off, we sync it back up onto a server. You may have scenarios where you don't always want that user's data to roam with them. So let's imagine a scenario with a manufacturing plant that's got finance people working there. And when they're in the finance office, when they're working on their machine they work on all the time, we should roam their data there. They should have their profile available to them and their sensitive data there. If they move out to the shop floor, where maybe we've got a shared machine, or maybe we've got a break room with a shared machine so that other people can access their email and things like that, when that finance user goes and logs in at one of those machines, we don't necessarily want their profile to roam there. We don't want to risk that sensitive data being left behind on those machines. So with user device affinity, we can actually set that up and say, hey, this group of users, this user works in finance, his primary machine is in the finance office. When he logs into that machine, roam his data to it. When he logs in anywhere else, just give him a local profile. Don't roam his data because we don't want anything sensitive ending up there. Another feature that we've got is DNSSEC, basically the ability to sign DNS zones. Very easy, one step, straightforward and able to do, which means that we can now trust the addresses that are being referred to us via DNS. Supports all the new DNSSEC standards and RFCs, and basically prevents the potential of someone poisoning our DNS records and redirecting, and making it appear someone is visiting a trusted site or a trusted machine or a trusted zone because somebody has accepted an untrusted record in DNS. We now sign all our DNS records with DNSSEC, make sure that and that's working correctly. Encrypted hard drives with BitLocker is another feature. Again, this has been around for a couple of versions of Windows, but we're making it easier to do now. First of all, we've improved the performance of the encryption, so the drive your access to your data works much faster. We also take advantage of moving some of that decryption and decryption operations off to the hardware. So instead of the CPU having to do all the calculations of the algorithms to do the encryption and decryption, if you've got hardware that supports doing that, we can offload that workload now, take it off the CPU. And then we can also just set up auto encryption. So if you want to set it up by policy, hey, anybody plugs a thumb drive into a machine, we want to make sure that data is encrypted. It'll go ahead and just and set that up by policy that we're going to encrypt using BitLocker any devices that are plugged in. Any laptops, we can require that if they are domain joined, BitLocker is automatically applied and configured on those laptops, so that if the thumb drive is lost, if the drive is lost, if the hard drive is stolen, if the laptop is stolen for that matter, the data is encrypted. Unless someone knows the encryption key or is using a trusted login, they're not going to have access to that data. So lots of choices. We're giving you lots of options in how do you want to maintain the security and the compliance of your data. We can do it at the file level and with dynamic access control. We can do it at the drive level with BitLocker. You can mix and match depending on your needs. And that is wraps up our discussion of the modern work style and what we're doing here. Access from virtually anywhere on any device using remote desktop technologies and direct access. A full Windows experience anywhere, taking advantage of the remote FX for WAN improvements to give you that great Windows experience. And enhanced data security and compliance using dynamic access control, using BitLocker to make sure your data is secure. Thank you very much for attending this session.